Hey folks, we're live. How about that? I think it worked tonight. So that's good. No fumbling around is good fumbling around. You know, I do radio with Rocky and Jeff all the time. And what's funny is that you can have all your settings set for something. You go in the next time and it's all screwed up. So once again, sorry a little bit about last night and the trouble we had getting online. But tonight it seems like it's going okay. So here we are. We're live. And as those of you who have been here, and let's give a minute for other people to get here that wanted to be here. As you know, I've been doing readings from my book, The Rise and Fall of the Nephilim. And this is it here. That's the cover. And this is the book that I wrote in 2011 after years of research. And it was published later in 2011 by New Page Books, who is now owned by Red Wheel Weiser. So it's now a Red Wheel Weiser book. So we started doing these readings because it was suggested to me, maybe you go in and start doing some readings of your books and see if you can get people that want to listen to what you have to say. And I know I do radio with Rocky and Jeff, as I've already mentioned, but I'm going to do a straight reading from the book. That doesn't mean I will not stop and make commentary on areas. And I'll also take your questions. I might not see all your questions right away, so be patient, because at the very end, I'll scroll back through and see if we missed anything, your questions and comments. And right now, I just want to say hey to Mark and Michelle and Casper. Glad to see you here already. And we'll just get going here in a minute. And so a lot of what is in this particular chapter is stuff you've heard me talk about before in different radio interviews, different shows that I've been on, hundreds of them over the last few years since this was published. And so you've heard some of the content before. And so it should be not new to you in that respect. But if you haven't read the book, this will be new to you to hear how it was originally written. And I will say again that labor of love, definitely, Michelle. And greetings to you, Mark. And as I have said about this before, many of my views have shifted a little bit since I wrote this book. And I'll say it again, I have been approached by Red Wheel Weiser to write a follow-up to this. And so one of these days soon, I hope to work on that. I've got a couple of book projects in the way first. Once I clear those out, then I'll probably jump into this. So what we've already read so far is the preface, the introduction, and we read chapter 1 last night, which was Science Almighty. And we ended that with the last paragraph of chapter 1 says, "The sons of God descended from the heavens and intermingled with the daughters of humans, taking whomever they chose, and the women conceived and bore children." Myth, superstition, religious folly, scientific fact. Let's move on to see how all of these blend into the stew pot of ancient history, contemporary experience, and the application of the scientific methodology, if any exists. And that brings us to chapter 2. And chapter 2, I wanted to have a little fun with it. I entitled it, "Who's Your Daddy?" From Elohim to Nephilim. And I start with a couple of quotes in this chapter. One by Shakespeare, "A rose by any other name would smell as sweet." And then also Genesis 1:26, which said, "Then God said, let us," note the plurality, "let us make humankind in our image, after our likeness, so they may rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move on the earth." And that's Genesis 1:26. Now, let me say right here, earlier this evening, I was watching a bit of that Morgan Freeman series. I can't remember what it's called, something about finding God or looking for God, something like that. And it's really well done, where he's going through comparative religions on things. And when I read just this little bit of the creation account, I saw in an episode this evening where he was going through different cultural, religious mythologies on the creation of the world from a religious point of view. And so it's very interesting. This is definitely the Judeo-Christian, obviously, because I'm pulling it from the Judeo-Christian Bible. And hi, Robin. No, you didn't miss much. I haven't really started reading yet. I'm kind of going through a little blether first to make sure that people who want to be here can get checked into the channel and into the chat room before I really get rolling. And Deb, hey yourself. And hey, Kitten, nice to see you all back here tonight. And so I think without too much further ado, I'm going to jump into this. Now, also, I just want to put in a little plug. I am on with Rocky Stucci on Rocky Stucci's Situation Room not long after we'll be done with this tonight. And by the way, those of you who the last time we did this had to bail a little bit to go see Jeff Doherty, I did talk to him today to make sure that I'm not in conflict with anything he does. He kind of, if you've noticed, if you're a follower of Jeff's, he does have a tendency to, he gets a thought and he'll jump on. And if he's on late night, he'll do the same thing. That's why he was only on about 8 minutes the other night during this time. So we're going to try as best as possible to avoid stepping on each other's toes or getting in the way. Now with Rocky Stucci, I'm on with him in 2 hours, a little less than 2 hours. It'll be midnight Eastern, 11 p.m. Central, and doing Rocky Stucci's Situation Room. So you'll have a full night of me for certain if you jump from this show to that one. And I don't think we'll be going 2 hours here, but you never know until you're into it. But we will end in time for Rocky Stucci's show. And you can find him right here on YouTube as well. Rocky Stucci's Situation Room. And I'm just going to see if anybody else has popped in or had anything to say before I really get going. More peeps coming in. Yes, there are indeed. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here. If you want to get into the chat, I think it's on that side, or is it that side? I can't tell. It's always opposite when I see it in rebroadcast. So it's at the column to, as I'm looking at my screen, the column to the right. So to the right, that way. So go ahead and jump in. And by the way, behind me tonight, I just want you to see, this is some of the mural I've been working on the last couple of weeks at my daughter's studio, Finfolk Productions, down in Lincolnton, North Carolina. I've been down here painting. And this is some of what I just finished today and a little bit yesterday, the big manta ray up on the top. And it runs down this wall right here, about 75, 80 feet to the corner, and then turns the corner for about another 20 feet. So it's been a big project and almost wrapping it up over the next couple of days. So that's the backdrop today. And I've tried to hit different sections of it as we do these readings. So here we go. If you're all ready, Chapter 2 of the Rise and Fall of the Nephilim. And by the way, remember I mentioned the subtitle of this book, The Untold Story of Fallen Angels, Giants on the Earth, and Their Extraterrestrial Origins. And that's right down here. And one of the big things, viewpoints I changed, even during the writing of the book, was that I don't think these beings were angelic. Because in the Hebrew, and we might even get into that in this chapter tonight, the word for angel is malach in the Hebrew, or malachim in the plural. And that word doesn't appear in context to these beings at all. They are Elohim. And we'll get to talk about that a little bit tonight. Okay, so here we go. Ready? And by the way, because I see it in the first sentence, I've got some Hebrew in this. I'm going to just see if you can see that. I've got some Hebrew, and it's right there. In several places, I've mentioned words that I bring up, and I put the original Hebrew word. I can't pronounce all of them, so let's forget about that. I'll just tell you that I put the Hebrew word in. So here we go. The Nephilim, the Hebrew word for them, have spawned myriad cultural mythologies, appearing in variant forms and by variant names throughout the annals of ancient historical and religious texts. From the offspring of the sons of God to the bright shining Tuatha De Danann of the ancient Celts, from Gilgamesh of Uruk to the Bigfoot of Native American lore, ranging from the religious to the ufological, the Nephilim seem to defy reasonable explanation except within two basic trains of thought: the metaphysical, which is always open to many various forms of spirituality and religious explanations, and the scientific, which may not wholly deny the existence of the spiritual, but will most likely not allow for the incorporation of such wondrous folly in making a determination that bears any kind of scientific veracity. On the spiritual metaphysical track, it's easy to accept non-scientific accounts of spirit beings, angelics, demonics, when attempting to comprehend the existence of a race that, quote, descended from the heavens, end quote, and cohabited with human women. It's even easier to believe when you consider the many accounts of demonically intrusive sexual encounters, not to mention similar tales of alien abductions and impregnations. But these sorts of explanations describe interactions that comprise a speculative mix of religion, spirituality, and meta-science. Some might say faux science. And many times a sort of parapsychology that is open to the possibilities of things beyond the veils that are seemingly impossible to pierce by the finite mind and the study of science. Yet even a more scientific approach, when it is not wholly dismissive of the entire notion of the Nephilim, while seeking out non-religious facts, sometimes yields just as fantastical an understanding. So let me put a little commentary here on the heels of chapter 1, which we called Science Almighty, where we were looking at the big two colliding trains on the same track, science and faith, or science and spirituality. They don't always mix. And sometimes we want to default so badly to the scientific that we're willing to eradicate or ignore the spiritual. And the same is true on the other side. Sometimes we want to be so spiritual or adhere to our religions or adhere to our religious mythologies that we want to poo-poo science, good science, in the process. So let's get back to the book. No matter which path you allow to dictate your train of thought, it is simple historical fact that the Nephilim in their various forms permeate the writings of ancient civilizations on a nearly pan-cultural basis. Now, I say that's a historical fact. What I'm saying is you can't historically prove that these beings exist. What you can prove is mention of them in any of their different forms as existed all through history in religious writings, which many of which were the official writings of ancient cultures. Let's see. Let me see if I can find my place. And no matter whether you follow a spiritual, metaphysical, paralogic, psychological, or scientific track, one fact stands firm. The very name of these mythical beings finds its source in the Old Testament faith writings of the Book of Genesis, with the Hebrew word Nephilim. In that source book, the Nephilim themselves are said to be the hybrid offsprings of the sons of God, or as the Hebrew calls them, the B'nai Ha-Elohim, the Watchers of the apocryphal Book of Enoch, whose pages include accounts of the Nephilim that parallel and even amplify the scant details that appear in the Book of Genesis, leading many to believe that the two accounts were based in the same source. And I've said many times that I believe Moses, in a sense, when he penned Genesis, plagiarized, if you will, from many different religious sources. And one of them is most probably the ancient work of Enoch, which I know Jeff Dougherty and I will disagree on this. He believes it was a pure forgery, the book that was discovered. Because it was, and then there were some, because it was penned in the 400s, say it can't be that ancient. At the same time, you have personages in the Old Testament writers, you have Jesus himself, you have the book of Jude, you have Peter. These guys all quoted from the Book of Enoch. And that's 2,000 years ago, and some of them older than that. So I used to say, I figure if Jesus could quote it, was good enough for me to quote. So whichever, it's an older book that was rewritten in the 400s, along with, like we mentioned last night, along with the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Old Testament that was recompiled in the 400s BC at the Library of Alexandria. That is the Old Testament you have in any Bible you pick up nowadays. It was written from the Septuagint. And I think the Book of Enoch was repenned at the same time. All right, moving on. Let's find my place. Where did I leave off? Because I moved my fingers. These so-called sons of God were, in turn, bequeathed, birthed, created by Elohim, the Hebrew name given to God so many thousands of times in the Jewish books of faith and law. So in seeking out this mythical race, the big question is this: do we define the Nephilim by spiritual texts and a faith-based understanding? Or are there explanations that fall outside the realm of spirituality, despite finding the name source point only within the scriptures of the Jewish spiritual literature? Larger yet is this question: are the two trains of thought actually one and the same, the scientific and the spiritual? Either the religious definitions are accurate, or the ancients simply defined those mythic beings in the only terms they could understand, those that fell within their finite realm of spiritual comprehension of how the universe worked, while at the same time upholding the monotheistic belief in God and his created caste of spirit beings. Now, I'm not going to suggest that the book of Genesis is not factual. This is for all of you. I don't want to step on any spiritual toes out there. I don't want to get anybody's religious undies in a rankle. But listen to what I'm saying here. I'm not going to suggest that the book of Genesis is not factual, nor will I suggest that the God of the Bible is not who the writers of those books say he is. I will, however, state emphatically that the Bible is a book of faith, governed by the dictates of a faith-based spirituality, thus rendering its facts the products of not only a faith-based culture, but a theocratic one. For the purposes of scholarly integrity, I have chosen as a leaping off point to examine first the Hebrew source of the word Nephilim. And to do that, we have to take the whole thing back a notch, further to the headwaters of the source point, the Hebrew scriptures. If the Nephilim were a mythical offspring of the sons of God, the B'nai Ha-Elohim, then who is the father? Who is this Elohim who bequeathed them? Now, let me take a look here. Rocky's in the room. Shut up, everyone. Rocky's in the room, and so is Robert. Yin Yang. Good to see you. All right. And She Said It is in the room as well. All right, next section of this chapter. God among many gods. When I first learned that one of the most common names for God was a plurality, I began to question the way I thought about much of what I've been taught about the Bible. And by plurality, I don't mean the triune manifestations of God, the Godhead, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. In other words, the Trinity. I'm referring to the Old Testament name Elohim, who is said to have bequeathed the B'nai Ha-Elohim, the sons of God in the English, who then had intercourse with human women and gave birth to the hybridic race of Nephilim. More than 2,500 times in the Old Testament, the Hebrew word used in reference to the name of God is Elohim. Interestingly enough, the word is not a mere name alone, but it's also a descriptor, in that it details physical attributes of the Hebrew God, also known as Yahweh. The word Elohim, or Jehovah. The word Elohim itself denotes plurality, specifically more than two, but it is almost most commonly used in the Hebrew text. Only, got you in suspense while I turn the page, only in conjecture with a singular verb or adjective. Now, those of you who enjoyed English class, I'm going to go through this a little bit, which can sometimes indicate a singular, individual God with a plurality of vast and many powers, depending on the context of the passage wherein it's found. There is also the argument that Elohim is a statement of the Hashashul. I always have problems because of the different consonants in this and vowels. Hashulash, Ha-Kodash, Ha-Kedash, there you go, or the Trinity, despite the fact that there is no indicated number limiting the plurality of Elohim to 3. Anti-Trinitarians would tell you that the term Elohim suggests only the multiplicity of power and majesty, as opposed to suggesting the word indicates a plurality of beings or a multiplicity of entities individually combined into a collective singular God. The word Elohim is also used as a collective plural reference to the many denounced false gods and idols throughout the Old Testament. As a matter of fact, there was a place in the Old Testament that had said, avoid the man going to the man's tent who has a multiplicity of Elohim that he sells from his tent, made out of clay or wood or bronze or whatever, speaking of idols and things like that. The literal translation of the word Elohim is, now remind you, this is the name of God used in the Old Testament over 2,500 times. The literal translation is God of many gods. More simply, God of gods. But to render this as a wholly polytheistic term would fly in the face of how Judaism's staunchest scholars would interpret the word. No higher authority on the Hebrew language can be found than the great Hebrew scholar Wilhelm Gesenius. He wrote that the plural nature of Elohim was for the purpose of intensification, and was related to the plural of majesty and used for amplification. Gesenius says that the language has entirely rejected the idea of numerical plurality in Elohim whenever it denotes one God, and is provided especially by its being almost invariably joined with a singular attribute. And there's a quote here that I reference, that the language has entirely rejected the idea of numerological plurality in Elohim, whenever it denotes one God, is proved especially by its being almost invariably joined with a singular attribute. In other words, and then it's got it in the Hebrew, and I didn't put the translation of the Hebrew here. He's talking about God as using a plural word to denote multiplicity of powers in the Hebrew. Hence, the word may have been used originally not only as numerical, but also in an abstract plural corresponding to the Latin numen and our Godhead, and like other abstracts of the same kind, have been transferred to a complete single God, even of the heathen. All right, so now if you got all that, it's saying that the word Elohim, which is a plurality, God of many gods, God of gods, could actually be meaning it's a singular word. And many times it's used that way, as a singular in language, depending on the context within the sentence. Okay? So in other words, although it's very tempting to extrapolate from the word Elohim a definition that renders it literally as God of many gods, that's the literal translation, it is more likely than not that in the Old Testament, a Jewish book of faith, it would be wholly inconsistent with the Jewish religion to present their God as anything but a singular, individual, monotheistic deity. To render the word Elohim as signifying that the Jews held to a polytheistic expression of God would simply fly in the face of their entire monotheistic belief system. Though certainly debated, the name Elohim, most probably, has to do with the first God encounter that humans experienced, at least with the Hebraic Jewish mindset. Those initial experiences produced awe or fear for the multiple powers of nature, as it is reflected in the Old Testament, where the word Elohim is used for God himself. But it is also used for the complete plurality of so-called idolatrous gods. The wooden and the stone images that people worshipped in their homes and in village localities, Elohim is even used to mean angels and judges. In the final analysis, the name Elohim has something to do with powers, the powers that be, the many-powered, power and majesty. In the traditional Jewish view, Elohim is the name of God as the creator and the judge of the universe. In Exodus 3:6, the plural name of Elohim is modified by its singular personal pronouns, said to be spoken by God in the first person. Quote Exodus 3:6, "The Holy One, blessed be he, said to those, you want to know my name? I am called according to my actions. When I judge the creatures, I am Elohim, and when I have mercy with the world, I am named Yahweh," or Jehovah. That's Exodus 3:6. Yet the Hebrew word Elohim does, without question, signify a plurality. Deciding whether or not that plurality indicates more than one God versus many powers and amplified majesty is where the debate starts and ends. When one usage of the word is said to mean a singular God with a vast array of powers, and another translation of the word indicates a plurality and or a vast array of idols or false gods, you see the inherent conflict and subsequent confusion. However, as we talked about earlier, it's all about context and the usage of the word as it's modified by the surrounding verbs and adjectives. In the beginning, God, Elohim, plural, created bara, singular, the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1:1. In the word Elohim, is the word Elohim being used in this context as a demonstration of the creative power of God, representing the volitional act of a divine collective of many gods, engaging in the act of the first creation? Is it a singular entity representing many gods? Or is it the God of vast and many powers doing the creating? You could agree that the act of creation is being done by a singular representation of Elohim. Or if you take it outside the religious mindset of the author of Genesis, you could interpret the language as meaning the creative act performed by a vast host of many gods embodied in the singular Elohim. However, you would have to consider the point of view of the author of the book of Genesis. Moses, so says Jewish tradition, and I believe there's no reason to doubt this fact, as I'll demonstrate in the following chapter on Moses and the 18th dynasty of Egypt, was a great lawgiver of the Hebrews, establishing the Ten Commandments, whose very mandate in the first commandment was, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt from the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me." Should the emphasis of this commandment be placed on the person of the singular Elohim, who commands that nothing should be put before him in the act of worship? Or should the emphasis be on the other gods, interpolating that other gods exist, but Jehovah God is the one who is demanding your worship if you're to follow him alone? Or is it simply metaphoric religious language? Genesis 1:26, which I quoted at the beginning of the chapter. Then God, Elohim, said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." Now, by the way, I see Mark saying, fingers and ears, la, 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 la. We'll have to see what that's about in a little bit here. Is God in this passage, Genesis 1:26, referring to himself in the third person, much as would an earthly monarch when speaking of the vast powers he or she holds in sway over his or her subjects? Or is this an example of a plurality of gods speaking as a singular entity? The emphasis would go on to a point of trivial exhaustion, as there are more than 2,500 of them throughout the Old Testament. So let us, plural, bring, singular, our, plural, examination, singular, of the word Elohim, plural, to a conclusion, putting it in context with our entire subject matter, the Nephilim. Here we go. You ready? Now, before we jump into this, let me just look back here. I have to see what some of you guys are saying. I would totally touch Scotty's mustache. Thank you, Rocky. I appreciate that. That makes my heart warm. And I shaved it down today, by the way. There you go. Just looking back. Rocky, how you doing? Jews must supervise and sometimes handle the entire winemaking process, from the time the grape are crushed until the wine is bottled, and any ingredients used, including findings, must be kosher. Okay, there has to be context to that. So maybe we'll hit that a little bit afterwards and just move on here. Let's see. Oh, not directed to me or the reading, Mark says. Putting fingers in the ears. Well, that's good to know. I appreciate that. Okay. What's Lolik? That must not be referencing what I'm talking about either. Let's get back into the book. All right. The source of the word Nephilim is found only in ancient Jewish religious writings, including the Bible's Old Testament books of Moses, the apocryphal Book of Enoch, and a few other scant biblical and non-biblical references. Now, something also I didn't mention here, it's also found in the books of Jasher and the Book of Jubilees, which were Jewish books that had been lost for a long time. Let's see. Whether you like it or not, the Judeo-Christian books of faith are the absolute source point for the word itself. That is not to say, and by the way, I'm referencing pop culture when I say that, about the word Nephilim. That is not to say that there are not dozens of other ancient cultures, and we'll get to that in chapter 4, that record accounts of the same beings under different labels and names. But for the sake of going to the source of the most commonly understood and used word for these beings, the Nephilim are sourced in Jewish scriptures. According to Genesis, it was Elohim who gave birth to or created beings known as the Watchers. According to Enoch, who are called the sons of God, the B'nai Ha-Elohim, in Genesis chapter 6. It is said that these sons of God descended to the earth and cohabited with human women, producing offspring called Nephilim. I actually wrote here, bing, bang, bada, boom. That one's for Rocky. But we still have one intermediate step to look at before getting to the Nephilim themselves, namely their earthly lineage, the one half of their crossbred parentage, the B'nai Ha-Elohim, or the sons of God. Now let's go to this is the next section of this chapter, the sons of God. Now that we've examined the plurality of the name of Elohim and the presentation of the Jewish concept that it meant more likely than not a singular God with vast majesty and possessing of many powers, we now need to examine his offspring. They are the characters in the account of the lineage of the Nephilim, known as the sons of God, the B'nai Elohim or B'nai Ha-Elohim, the parents, or at least one half of the parental line. Now, from Genesis 6, 1 through 4, this is where we find the passage about the Nephilim. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that these daughters were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with human beings forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went into the daughters of human beings and had children by them. They were the heroes of old and the men of renown." Now that's Genesis 6, 1 through 4. Now, I want to make a little commentary note here as we move on. I wrote this book in the context of understanding the Nephilim to be the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men, as the passage says. But you notice it says here, and this is something that came up long after I wrote this particular book and I started thinking about it some more. Notice it actually says, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward. It's talking about the time when human women were impregnated and married by the B'nai Ha-Elohim, the sons of God. And then it goes to say, and the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterwards. It doesn't actually say the Nephilim were the offspring. It says that they existed at the time that this was recorded, and they still existed afterward. So the big question I have since the writing of this book, which has led to lots of other research, which I'm going to be addressing whenever I get to the follow-up of this book, is the big question. Are the Nephilim the offspring, which I firmly believed when I wrote this book, or are the Nephilim something completely different than the offspring, and that they existed at the same time? We won't be answering that in this book because I didn't write about it, but I may be addressing that soon. So these 4 verses from Genesis chapter 6 appear in the preamble. Now, how many of you didn't know this? Did you know that those 4 verses on the Nephilim at Genesis 6, 1 through 4, is actually the preamble to the account of Noah's flood? Noah's name appears for the first time in the text in verse 8, where it states that he found favor in the eyes of the Lord. The passage goes on to state that Noah and his family, then the old, lost my place, that Noah and his family was the only righteous human left on the earth. And that's why he was chosen to be the builder of the great ark, or barge, which would preserve him, his family, and pairs of animals from the great watery judgment of God's wrath. And we'll examine later in this book the meaning of the word righteous and find out what that meant. Much more simple, that it meant much more. Okay, I misread that sentence. And we'll find out that it meant much more than simple spiritual goodness. So when they talk about Noah being the only righteous man, it doesn't mean what you think it means. I do not think that word means what you think it means. So these 4 verses comprise a very interesting passage in that it differs in writing style from the rest of the book of Genesis. Now get that. There's a style of hand. I'm not talking about physical handwriting, but the style of the text and the prose itself differs in these 4 verses from the rest of the book. Having earmarks of having been extracted, edited, and perhaps even plagiarized, at least in part, from other extant contemporary source material. If you've ever written a term paper for school, it's like paraphrasing bits and pieces of material from external sources without quoting that source. After extensive study of this passage, Dr. David Penchansky, chair of the University of St. Thomas, I don't think he's chair of the university. I'm not sure. I think he's the chair of Hebrew Studies at the university. I think I found that out after we printed this book, that I forgot that second part of his title. He's the chair of Hebrew Studies at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. He stated in a personal conversation with me, quote, "This passage has been edited, either by the writer of Genesis or by later scribes. It most certainly does not match the writing style of the rest of the book. And the language in which it's written is choppy, almost as if it's reproduced in the text as snippets from other source material. And the account was, obviously, far too well known at the time to be omitted completely," end quote. So what he's saying is these 4 verses we find about the Nephilim in Genesis chapter 6, 1 through 4, have earmarks of being taken from a different source and plunked into the place, or edited later by scribes, which is not impossible. Could have happened during the rewriting of the Old Testament by the 72 rabbis who wrote the Septuagint in the 400s, post-Babylonian captivity. So now on to the next section. Who are the sons of God? The term B'nai Ha-Elohim, and again I have the Hebrew here in the text. I'll show you just so you know what I'm talking about. Right there. There's the Hebrews in there. So, so the term B'nai Ha-Elohim, or sons of God, is found only 4 times in the Old Testament. Genesis 6, 1 through 4, Job 1, 6, and 2, 1, Job 38, 7, and Psalm 29, 1. That's the whole term, B'nai Ha-Elohim, the sons of the God of many gods, or those who are of the God of many gods. Let's see, I'm just seeing yin-yang. Nephilim were the offspring of the Anunnakian humans. Hence Elul's desire to let them die in the impending catastrophe of the Antarctic displacement resulting from the planetary passing of Tiamat. That's one theory. That's one explanation, I should say, not theory. So who are the sons of God? The term here, Bnei Ha-Elohim, or sons of God, is found, and I mentioned, in the Genesis 6:1-4 passage. We're told that the sons of God looked upon human women. Other translations refer to these women as the daughters of man or men, men's daughters, the beautiful women of the human race, and even those girls. That had to be the naysayers. They mixed up and they hooked up with those girls. And they saw that they were beautiful, it says in the text. In some translations, the sons of God lusted after them and then married any of them they chose. Or in some translations, they took the ones they liked. The title Sons of God has been viewed several ways, and various translations refer to them as God's sons, heavenly beings, and sons from the heavens. It is clear to most biblical scholars that the title Sons of God refers to angelic beings. Now, I'm not so sure about that anymore. Once again, because Elohim appears as opposed to Malach or Malachim, which is the Hebrew for angel or angels. It is clear to most biblical scholars that it refers to them as angelic beings, and this is supported by other passages throughout the Old and New Testaments, as well as the apocryphal Book of Enoch and various other historical texts. It is interesting to note that even Jesus of Nazareth himself was called the Son of God. So these are the sons of God, these Elohim. They're the Bnei Ha-Elohim, the sons of God. And I think I had some mistranslation, some misunderstanding of the word when I refer to them as angelic beings, because they're definitely not. Otherwise, they would have used that word in the Hebrew text. So, what you've got here are the sons of God, and as I mentioned at the end there, even Jesus himself was known as the Son of God. But remember, they also referred to him in the New Testament. They changed it up a bit. They said he was the only begotten Son of God. Not meaning the only birthed, meaning the most important. There was more connotation to this kind of Son of God that he was. However, different views are taken on the Genesis 6:1-4 passage. Sons of God simply refers to men, is one of the interpretations. The sons of the nobles, who are the patrons of the school of the prophets, who married the daughters of the common people down in the valley. Now, that's what I was told, if you remember my story from my seminary days. I was told, Scotty, there's nothing mystical here. These were just the sons of the patrons of the school of the prophets who went slumming down in the valley with the common women. This is the view of many Jewish authorities, as well as professors from my own theological roots in fundamental conservative Baptist seminary circles, who hold that the sons of God are only human men, justified by the use of Elohim being defined as judges in other passages such as Exodus 21:6 and 22:8. But this simply means other passages such as Exodus 21:6 and 8. But this simply means, sorry, I messed up two sentences there, but this simply means by which certain theologians, all right, hang on. Start that sentence over for the third time. But this is simply a means by which certain theologians avoid dealing with the intermingling of spirit beings and human women, because it didn't fit their theology. An entire notion that falls far too close to an admission that there is more than just humanity inhabiting the universe. This is a perfect example of good scholars using disingenuous scholarship for a means to squeeze the interpretation of certain words into their particular theological point of view. Boom. Sons of God, Bnei Ha-Elohim, is used in this passage to demonstrate the stark contrast to the term daughters of men. From Elohim to Adam, A-D-A-H-M, Adam. Or remember the name Adam and Eve. which simply means man. So Adam, the daughters of men. God to man. When you read Elohim in conjunction with other words in the context, you have to view the Hebrew word for men, Adam. It simply means the human race of men. If indeed the sons of God, the B'nai Ha-Elohim, refers only to mere mortal men of the upper classes seeking to marry the daughters of the lower classes, the word Adam would not be contrasted with the word B'nai Ha-Elohim. And when used in the same context with Elohim, Adam signifies the human race in contrast to the divine. The B'nai Ha-Elohim were anything but human beings, and that is in strict unity with the Hebrew language of the passage. Some theologians hold that the sons of God are to be understood as the pious, righteous race descended from Seth, Adam and Eve's third son, and that the daughters of men is to be interpreted as the daughters of worldly men. However, the language simply does not state that. And again, it's intellectually disingenuous and a theological stretch to say that it does. Now, I'm going to say here, my little commentary, I've talked about this before, is that when I brought this question to my seminary professors, I said, why is there a contrast? You teach us that language and words mean things. That's why we study these original languages in school. Why is there a contrast? If these guys, the sons of God, the sons of Elohim, the sons of the God of many gods, if these guys were only human guys that were sons of the patrons of the school of the prophets, why doesn't the passage say that? Why does it contrast them to human women? That's the question you have to ask. Whoever they were, the text makes it clear that they were bequeathed by God, who was above them. Sons by birth or sons by creative act, their point of origin is clear in all accounts. They came from the heavens and had some claim to being called sons of God. The following passage from the Book of Enoch introduces them within the framework of the Jewish Christian tradition. At the time, only Jewish tradition. Despite their appearance in a book that was banned from the canonical scriptures by the church, and offers up a startlingly similar account to Genesis 6, 1-4 passage. Now listen, this is from the Book of Enoch. It happened after the sons of men had multiplied in those days, that daughters were born to them, elegant and beautiful. And when the angels, the sons of heaven, beheld them, they became enamored of them, saying to each other, "Come, let us select for ourselves wives from the progeny of men, and let us beget children." Then their leader, Shamyaza, said to them, "I fear that you may perhaps be indisposed to the performance of this enterprise, and that I alone shall suffer for so grievous a crime." In other words, Shamyaza is saying, you guys are going to do this, but I'm your leader, so my ass is the one that's on the line. And they all said, "We all swear together." And they bind themselves by mutual execrations, that we will not change our intention, but execute our projected undertaking. Then they swore all together, and all bound themselves by mutual execrations. Their whole number was 200, who descended upon Ardis during the days of during the days of Jared, which is the top of Mount Armon, which is Mount Hermon in present-day Israel. That mountain, therefore, was called Armon, because they had sworn upon it and bound themselves by mutual execrations. These are the names of their chiefs: Shamyaza, who was their leader. Some of these names I still can't pronounce. Ureka ben Amiel, Akabael, Tamiel, Ramuel, Danel, Azkael, Sarakanel, Azazel, Yamyeel, Erazazel. These were the prefects of the 200 angels, and the remainder were all with them. Then they took wives, each choosing for himself, whom they began to approach, and with whom they cohabited, teaching them sorcery, incantations, and the dividing of roots and trees. And the women conceiving brought forth giants. Now that's where you have the Nephilim being the offspring, the giants. And by the way, giant was actually originally thought to be a misinterpretation of the passage, and we'll get into that. All right. And by the way, and then here's a picture I have in the book. Probably very hard to see on here. That's looking west from the slopes of Mount Armon. And Mount Armon is Mount Hermon in the north of Israel. And you can see that today. It's a twin-sloped mountain. It's actually, it's the mountain that divides northern Israel from Lebanon. And it's a huge ski resort nowadays. Huge ski resort town at the base of the mountain. That is Mount Armon. So it's the place where you can go to ski and celebrate the fact that 200 prefects from heavens, celestial beings, came down and intermingled with human women. According to Enoch, the sons of God were created, bequeathed angelic beings who descended or fell down to the earthly realm, and on the slopes of Mount Hermon made a pact to produce offspring with human women. To ascribe malevolence to these angels would not be wholly accurate. There's no malevolence, by the way, mentioned here. There's no evil intent. But Enoch's book does intimate that should they carry out their plan, they were in fear of being held responsible for enacting a, quote, sinful deed in the eyes of God. Enoch goes on to tell the attributes they brought down to the human race with them. Enchantments, the making of weaponry, metallurgy, astrology, astronomy, interpretations of moon phases, herbology, and the signs of the sun, stars, and moon. With these angelic taught skills, mankind delved the lowest common denominator by developing the art of warfare and pursued wickedness to the point of stirring up Jehovah's wrath. The sons of God were indeed held to blame. Shemyaza, their leader, somehow overlooked, and Azazel held as the main culprit for introducing weapons and warfare to man. And then there was their giant offspring. Now, something to note here is that all of these beings are said to have brought all of these things to mankind, which you also hear in some of the ancient texts of Oannes, some of the Sumerian texts that talk about how Oannes and his people, the half fish, half men, would rise up out of the Euphrates River during the day, and they would bring this forbidden knowledge of the gods to humans. This is what they're doing in the Book of Enoch. These watchers, these sons of God, the Bene Ha-Elohim, marrying women, and they're bringing them the forbidden knowledge of God, is what this is saying. This is like the old mythologies that say all the things we developed as humans came from beings teaching them to us, celestial beings. Now, that's what this story is about. But it's also interesting to note that these are the sons of the Elohim, and we'll get to this later in the book, and we've already talked about this a bit, is that Nakosh, the serpent character in the Garden of Eden story, was also one of these bright, shining ones from heaven. He was one of the Elohim. And what was his great sin? Bringing the forbidden knowledge of God to the humans. What does it say in Genesis 3? At the fall of mankind, the serpent gives the fruit to Eve, who gives it to Adam. And it says that their eyes were opened, they were naked, and that they violated the eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And for this, Elohim was going to come down and prevent them from also eating of the tree of life. So it's very interesting we start looking at this. So let's move on. The Nephilim is the next chapter header here. And this is the last 2 pages of this chapter. According to Scripture, the offspring of the sons of God and human women were the Nephilim. But I do not believe the term is solely attributable to the offspring only. The sons of God who descended from the heavens were known as the Nephilim once they took up residence in the earthly realm. So they and their offspring together became known as the Nephilim. It is similar to the scenario you have when, say, an Irish immigrant moves his existence to America. He is Irish, but his emigrating act has given him the new title of American. And he and his offspring are now known by both titles, Irish and American, possessing a dual identity. But the children born to him in America bear the stronger title. The writers of the 1611 King James Bible, King James Bible, may it long stand forever, may you not quote from any other passage of Scripture other than that which is interpreted by the 1611 King James Bible, because it's the one and only Bible bequeathed by God. I say that all facetiously. The writers of the 1611 King James Bible indirectly translated the word Nephilim as giants, yet the preferred scholarly translation is fallen ones. Giant can better be understood when you ascribe the values of height, distance from the ground to the top, descending from the heights, falling from the heavens, and so forth. Although there are many scholarly views on the identity of the Nephilim, you have to take into consideration the interpretation of the word based on the surrounding textual context, as well as the audience for whom the text was written. The root word for Nephilim is the verb nephal, meaning one, to fall to the ground, to fall in battle, to be cast down, to desert a location, to fall, to fail. The im, the Hebrew text suffix, denotes plurality, giving us the fallen down ones or the ones who descended. And further definition I found after I wrote this was those who left their first estate in exchange for another. So it's not always meaning a fall, that they did something naughty and they were kicked out. So this doesn't necessarily mean fallen angels. It has to do with leaving one place and dropping down to another, coming down, in the celestial sense, coming down from the sky. The sons of God can best be defined as a race of beings who descended or fell to the earth, abandoning their existence and habitation in the heavenly realms. And heavenly I use as that which is above the earth. And if you believe in a round earth, that which is above the earth from all angles. That's for you flat earthers. Their offspring bore the title of Nephilim, and the propagation. Let's see. Hold on. I missed a sentence. According to the Bible, they were angelic in origin, birthed or created by God, Elohim, and they brought to the human inhabitants of the earth special skills as well as an unearthly libido. Their offspring bore the title of Nephilim, and the propagation of their mixed race on the earth led to the judgment of God in the form of a great flood, according to the scriptures, as described in Genesis and other ancient accounts. Also mentioned in the Book of Enoch is the fact that these beings descended to the earth during the days of Jared, who is the father of Enoch. His name literally means descent, and he was named thus because of the descent of the sons of God to the earth that took place during his lifetime. It's interesting at this point to note that both Jared and Enoch are also mentioned in the Genesis account in the Old Testament. It says in Genesis 5:18 through 24, when Jared was 162 years old, his son Enoch was born. After the birth of Enoch, Jared lived another 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. He died at the age of 962. When Enoch was 65 years old, his son Methuselah was born. After the birth of Methuselah, Enoch lived another 300 years in close fellowship with God, and he had other sons and daughters. Enoch lived 365 years in all. He enjoyed a close relationship with God throughout his life. Then suddenly, he disappeared because God took him. It's an interesting passage. In the older archaic English of the 1611 King James Version of the Bible, that last verse is worded, "And Enoch walked with God and was not, for God took him." Digest all of that. Then take a deep cleansing breath. Elohim begat the Bene Ha-Elohim, who begat the Nephilim. But that is simply one version of events. The question that still begs to be asked and answered is, what if the Nephilim, as defined by other cultural writings of the day, are something completely different? What if the Jewish Bible is only a version of events, as understood and written by a monotheistic culture who recorded those events from within their framework of understanding, from within a monotheistic, monotheocratic structure? What if these angelic beings were anything but angels? As always is the case, the uncovering of the basic facts only leads to deeper questions. And by the way, I have to quote my friend Robert Bauer. I'm trying to think of the word, info matriculation, info machination, info something. He might spell it out in the chat room there for us. Whenever you start thinking you are uncovering something that seems awfully simple on its surface, you will find it is the uncovering of information that matters. And it's that information you will find that is sometimes a hell of a lot deeper than what you originally thought it meant. Let's see. What if these angelic beings were anything but angelic? As is always the case, the uncovering of the basics only leads to deeper questions. As we move forward, we'll tackle the issue of extraterrestrial origins and the seeding of mankind. Now, keep in mind, I said yesterday, extraterrestrial doesn't always mean aliens, like you think of in Star Trek or Star Wars, although it could. It just means simply not of this earth. So we'll be digging into that next. But first, let's move on to an all-important historical examination of Moses, the author of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, or as the Jewish religion calls it, the Torah. Once you have an understanding of this man's origins and why he wrote the things he wrote, you start to gain a clearer picture of just who the Nephilim really are and why Moses wrote the things he wrote. And that, folks, is the end of chapter 2. And I'll give you a hint. Chapter 3 is entitled The Pharaoh God of Israel. And who was Moses really? Exodus 33:11 says, Yahweh spoke to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend. So we'll get into that tomorrow. So now, that was chapter 2. I'm going to go back and see some of the comments we have here, and let's talk about this a little bit. Let's see. Mark says, just the latest. Yeah, Scotty sure can sling them sentences. Okay. Here, let's go back a little bit. I want to see. I know that there were things being said, and I didn't want to stop in the reading of this. Let's see. I'm going back, and I'll try to address things. So stick around, and let's chat a little bit about this. I've got people coming in and saying hi and hey, and we said hi and hey, and hopefully recognize most of you as you were coming in. Let's see. Robin says beautiful. I'm not sure what you're referring to there. Let's see. Deb says shut up. That's obviously when Rocky came in. Let's see. Talented artist. Thank you, Deb. Yeah, I've been working on this mural for quite a while. 2 weeks, a little over 2 weeks now. Mostly because of its size. So I've been away from home for nearly 3 weeks now. There is no try, mark, only do, or the pathway to do, small steps. I'll agree with that. Let's see, merely parroting a meme. The Big Cannoli is live. Rocky is here. Okay, that's how far back I am. Meatball up. Rocky's here. I found that Mark says, practicing clearing my throat helps with vocalizing Hebrew. Did any of you ever see the old show? It's now an old show, Frasier, where he's called on to speak at a bar mitzvah, and he didn't know how to speak in Hebrew, and he said he could handle it though. And some kid exchanged his notes with Klingon, so instead of speaking in Hebrew, you know, B'nai Cha, Elohim, and all of those kinds of words with the gutturals in them, he's speaking pla, kach, pla, tak, bak, tokach. And as he's reading Klingon and thinks he's reading, and the rabbi had no idea what he was saying. So, yes, good phlegm is required. Needs smoke and scotch, I agree. Let's see. Rocky situation room, smooth my connection. Good, the connection was good, I hope. She said it, I mentioned this earlier, the Jews must supervise, sometimes handle the entire winemaking process. All right, I'm not sure what the context was on that still. Maybe you'll have mentioned it in here. Rocky said he'd totally touch my mustache. Me too. There, that's for Rocky. Let's see, fingers and ears, LOL, lick, ick, Rocky says. Let's see, what's, blah, blah, blah. The singular, plural, singular montage is confusing to me. Who's on first? Exactly. The word Elohim was actually a word that could be used. It's like our English word, nothing like it, but it's like the usage of the word deer. I can see a deer in my front yard, singular. I can see a herd of deer in my backyard, plural. So it all depends on the context of the sentence as to how you're using that word, plurally or singularly. So Elohim was the same way. Elohim was a singular word that spoke of the majesty of the powers of God. It was also a word that could be used as a plural, Elohim, him being the plural suffix, to denote plurality, literal plurality. Now remember, and I didn't mention it in this passage, I may have mentioned it last night, I just talked about this, is that you go to Psalm 82 and you will see both the word Elohim is plural, Elohim is singular, where God is speaking to the divine council, and he refers to them as Elohim, these beings, using the same word that he uses for himself as a singular God. Then he speaks to the plurality of gods and calls them gods, all the same word being used. Hope that helps. Enoch was a forefather of the Anakim. The Bible describes him as very tall descendants of the Nephilim. That's true. You also know that Goliath, of the famous David and Goliath story, was one of the Nephilim. The Bible references it. And did you know he also had 3 brothers? You don't hear that in the story of Goliath, but you find that out later in Old Testament passages. Because what David did after slaying Goliath, he mounted up and they hunted down the 3 brothers of Goliath, who were also of the Nephilim. Now, there's something to that. Did they just go kill them because they were Goliath's brothers? Or was there more to that? Is there really something more behind the passage of the David and Goliath story? Why did David take his head from his body? Why did David keep that head? You'll notice that David did this act when he was roughly an older teenager, 19 or 20. He was the youngest of his father's sons, tending the sheep. He took the head of Goliath. And then it says, and he brought the head of Goliath and the sword of Goliath to Jerusalem with him. Now, the interesting fact behind that story, which it doesn't mention in the passage, David did not conquer the city of Jerusalem for another 13 years. So if he took the head of Goliath and the sword of Goliath to Jerusalem with him, that's 13 years later. So he's probably got that head mounted on a pole, and it was a standard of his army. Remember, these were bloody times and ruthless people. So David is a whole nother story. You want to read a good book, by the way? And I want to do some commentary on this topic. I read a great book by Joel Baden, Yale professor of Old Testament theology. He wrote a book called King David, and then it was subtitled The Real Story of an Invented Hero. And he goes through all the apologetics of the Old Testament and how that David was a real guy. He was a real king, no reason to deny that, but that he probably wasn't the nice guy you think he was. So, a lot to that stuff. God said, let us make man in our image. And Yin Yang's a Heinz 57. Cool. And yes, that's exactly what happened. Fuel of warmth and laughter. Why do I have the feeling we all will be talking about Jesus tonight on the show? Hey, we didn't talk about Jesus tonight. Or are you talking about your show, Rocky? We'll find out. Which, by the way, folks, starts in less than 1 hour. Rocky Stucci's Situation Room. And I'll be on with him tonight. The Nephilim were the offspring of the Anunnaki and humans. It says yin yang. Hence Enlil's desire to let them die in the impending catastrophe of the Antarctic displacement resulting from the planetary passing of Tiamat. And that's all great stuff, but it's not in the passages. That's things we come to after the fact. Let's see. Being wine and waters. It'll be a long sermon show. Let's see. Who are the Rephaim? They're the same kind of beings. I thought the Rephaim were the offspring of the human and Nephilim, says Deb. Giants like Goliath, maybe. No, it says Goliath was one of the Nephilim. One of the children of the Nephilim, it calls him. And Mark says, I just answered a question that he was going to ask. I don't know what that question was. Well, maybe not answered in total. Shannon Kling says, hello. Hi, Shannon. I don't know if you're still in here. Nice to see you, Shannon. Let's see. Yo, 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 Rocky Stucci, she says. Let's see. Shannon Kling, yep. They made a pact. Hit like guys, yep. Love ya. Just going through to see if there's anything else we need to talk about. Shannon Kling from Elohim. Yahweh was a seriously pissed off cat in the Old Testament with some familial issues. Ain't that the truth, Robert? If you notice, remember that there was a, and it wasn't Yahweh that was the pissed off one. It was Elohim. Yahweh was more the savior type that came in. I believe Elohim and Yahweh were two different beings, two different gods. And so in the Old Testament, yeah, there was the wrath of God thing. Remember when God was so pissed off at the Israelites after the Exodus, he told Moses he was going to wipe them all out and restart the covenant instead of with Abraham's children, with the children of Moses. And it says, and Moses talked him out of this. He talked God down off the ledge. God was so pissed off he was going to wipe them all out. Moses said, you can't do this. You'd be breaking your word. You can't do that. And it said, God, get this, repented of the evil he was going to do. So not only did God repent, God's mind was changed by a human. Very interesting, huh? So yeah, God was a pissed off type. And then Yahweh was supposed to be his replacement. Let's see. Going on. Is that a manta ray on the mural? Janine Griffin asks. Yes, it is. That's a manta right there. So, and it's big. The context of that, that's about 7-8 feet behind me. So that gives you an idea of the size. The fall, Mark asks, leaving their first estate. Is it from spiritual to physical without permission or commission? Yes, it's kind of like that. It's like going from one place to another. They left the one place and went to another. They went without permission. They went of their own volition. That's what that means. And they kind of paid the price for it. Robert now knows where his libido comes from. It's heavenly. Let's see. The Great Commission, meaning the Great Commission or compensation. Commission as in sent on a mission, like Jesus. Yep. 6 cubits in a span. She said it, mentions that. That's the biblical measurement for the height of Goliath. Now, we don't know exactly what a cubit was, but a cubit was supposed to be the distance between a man's elbow and the tip of his fingers. That's a cubit. Now, of course, not all men were built the same. Some men's cubit was a little longer than another man's cubit. So that's roughly a cubit. So 6 of those, and a span was the width of the hand. So it was 6 cubits in a span. Now, that works out to be roughly, depending on whose arm you use, a little over 9 feet tall. Now, we don't know if that was his physical height or his height with his helmet and the feathers, the Philistine. Were they exaggerating, or was he just a big dude? That's all we know. So yes, Goliath was 6 cubits in a span, according to the scripture. Let's see. Kramer speaking Klingon. Yep. Got to see that episode. It's worth watching. You might be able to find it on YouTube. And Cupid Envy. Exactly. Let's see. Cannon Free. Michelle Cannon Free. I'm not sure what that's about. Michelle. I'm kidding. So there you go, folks. There it is tonight. I hope you enjoyed the reading tonight. And we're going to continue with chapter 3 tomorrow. And sometime in here in the next few days, I'll be flying back home. So there might be a little glitch in the schedule of a day or two. But I'm going to try to hit these every night. And so same bat time, same bat channel tomorrow night. We'll shoot for 10 o'clock Eastern, 9 p.m. Central, and we'll hit chapter 3. So again, thank you for being here, Shannon. Love you too. Thank you for being here. Kitten, Mark, Michelle, everybody else up in there. I hope I mentioned you all. Thanks for showing up. Thanks for being here. And watch for tomorrow night's live stream. And if you don't see an announcement, just head over right around 10 o'clock and we'll be here. And I like to start right on the nuts. So 10 o'clock, I go. So if you want to be here a few minutes early, that's good, and start stacking up so I know you're here. All right, folks. Thanks again for being here. See you tomorrow night. And by the way, in now 45 minutes, see you on Rocky's Situation Room live. Talk to you soon, folks. Bye.